Good evening and welcome to the Executive Speaker Night series. For those who may not know me, I'm Luca Pawanga, a professor of economics and finance in the Anderson College of Business and Computing at Regis University. And I'm also the host of the Executive Speaker Night series. Today, my guest is Dr. Vivek Lall from the Global Atomics. He's the chief executive, and like the way we say it here, chief executive officer, they don't have the officer at the end. And I would like to begin by asking Dr. Lall to give us a brief history of himself. Who are you? What makes you tick?
Right. Well, thank you, Professor, for this opportunity, and it's great to talk to all of you. So I am, by training, my PhD is in aerospace engineering. I have then also done an MBA. I started my career doing research with NASA, and then worked for various companies, including Raytheon, Boeing, Lockheed Martin. And as you mentioned, Professor, I'm now Chief Executive at General Atomics Global Corporation here in San Diego, although today I'm speaking to you from New Delhi, where I'm visiting. And so I, throughout my career, have been fascinated by engineering issues, mostly in the aerospace field, and worked with different governments around the world. I grew up in different parts of the world. I was the son of a diplomat, and so I happened to be born in Indonesia because my parents were there at the time. Lived in Tanzania, Africa for 4 years. Lived in the UK, lived in Vienna, Austria. Did my bachelor's in mechanical engineering in Canada, and then master's, PhD, and MBA in the United States. So, and ever since in these different roles, been traveling around the world and talking to different governments on various technology and policies.
Excellent. Now let's get into the actual discussion of nuclear energy. How could nuclear energy help meet the high demand for electricity without hurting the environment? That's what most people are worried about.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. As you probably know, nuclear energy does not emit carbon dioxide or other noxious gases that are known to cause air pollution or global warming. It is also the only clean energy source, in my opinion, that can produce baseload power 24/7 at a very high power density, and that's important. I think one of the key things in terms of general knowledge about nuclear energy, that it is indeed a zero emission clean energy source. It generates power through fission, which is the process of splitting uranium atoms to produce energy. The heat released by fission is used to create steam that spins a turbine to generate electricity without the harmful byproducts emitted by fossil fuels. So according to Department of Energy and the Nuclear Energy Institute, the US avoided more than 476 million metric tons, for example, of carbon dioxide emissions in 2019. That's the equivalent of removing 100 million cars from the road and more than all other clean energy sources combined. So it also keeps the air clean by removing thousands of tons of harmful air pollutants each year that contribute, as you all may know, to acid rain, smog, things like lung cancer, cardiovascular disease, etc. The other aspect that I mentioned briefly is that nuclear fuel is extremely dense. It's about a million times greater than that of other traditional energy sources that you can think of. And because of this, the amount of used nuclear fuel is not as big as, many of us may think. If you take all the used nuclear fuel by the US nuclear energy industry over the last 60 years, that all could fit in a football field at a depth of less than 10 yards. So that puts it in perspective. And that case also, in fact, can be reprocessed and recycled. And there are new advanced reactor designs that are being developed now that could operate on some of that used fuel.
You mentioned the fact that nuclear energy tends to be more dense in terms of energy. So if you compare with solar or hydro or any of the renewable energy sources, how do you, what advantage does nuclear energy have over these energy sources in terms of capital of the energy?
Yeah, that's a great question. Despite producing massive amounts of carbon-free power, nuclear energy produces more electricity on less land than any other clean air source. So if you take a typical 1,000 megawatt nuclear facility in the US, that needs little more than 1 square mile to operate. And the Nuclear Energy Institute, for example, says that wind farms would require 360 times more land area, 360 times more land area to produce the same amount of electricity. And solar photovoltaic cells or photovoltaic plants, would require 75 times more space. So to put that in perspective for all of us, you would need more than 3 million solar panels to produce the same amount of power as a typical commercial reactor, or more than 430 wind turbines. So that gives you some sort of comparative statistics on the issue.
Excellent. So what have you found as the most contentious issues surrounding nuclear energy?
Yeah, so I mean, and so, I'm sure we've all seen a lot of the debates in the media and so forth. But fundamentally, the biggest issues, as I see it, surrounding nuclear energy are the handling and disposal of the radioactive waste and the public awareness relative to the safety of nuclear power plants, preventing the use of nuclear fuel, of course, for other non-energy public energy consumption purposes, and also the high capital cost of building new nuclear power plants. So these are some of the things that rise to the surface as contentious issues when we come to nuclear energy.
So you're talking about cost. Is there another hurdle or other hurdles besides cost which are blocking the bringing nuclear energy to underserved countries or regions like Africa, for instance?
Yeah, so that's a great question. As I think through that, I think there are four areas. One is, as we've talked about, the cost of the infrastructure, of course. The second is the availability of indigenous trained workforce. The third thing I can think of is the regulatory infrastructure that needs to be in place. And as I mentioned, one of the concerns and contentious issues, and the fourth one in my mind, is the radioactive waste disposition. So how do you do that effectively? And modern day Africa, in my view, will have to gear up to tackle these challenges by way of, in my opinion, international collaborations. standing up of universities, for example, to produce graduates that are skilled in nuclear engineering and related disciplines to be able to put things like this together. You know, obviously policy making, negotiating the economic packages that would be required with reactor vendors, for example, supplying their technologies into Africa. So these would be some of the elements that the African governments would have to consider if they choose to move in this direction.
Now, if you look at nuclear energy, is it a one-trick pony, so to speak? What are some alternative non-traditional applications that we can use for nuclear energy?
Yeah, you put it well, and that is a good question, Professor. I think other than producing electricity, the process heat produced in the nuclear core that can also be used directly for applications such as hydrogen production. And, you know, someone mentioned hydrogen earlier. So high temperature of advanced reactors allow for various cogeneration benefits. And that's really from the emissions of the process heat. So I do think there are other applications. And I think the direction where many governments are going with respect to hydrogen, for example, mandates a closer look at these other possibilities so that it's not a one-trick pony, as you said.
Yeah, you mentioned the fact that one of the, some of the impediments to deploying nuclear energy in Africa, for instance. So how can we make it possible for low-income countries to be able to use nuclear energy, other than depending on maybe DFIs and other non-government organizations?
Yes, that's an important question because, frankly, the nuclear industry is struggling to compete. There are very challenging market conditions. So there are strict regulations on maintenance, staffing levels, operator training, things of that nature, and then inspections, et cetera. So it becomes quite a financial burden on the industry. Now, having said that, I think there are certainly, what does all this drive? It drives innovation, and it drives more research and new technologies and cost-effective technologies. And I think you're beginning to see a lot of that in various pockets. And innovation, in my view, would be the way to go.
Let's look at the long term. How does nuclear energy compare with other sources of energy? Is it a sustainable type of energy, or is it short term, you have to keep replacing it? How do we make, how does the comparison look like?
Yes, so, in my view, nuclear energy is indeed sustainable. If you look at those that are operating nuclear power plants, if you look at those countries that are actually expanding more and more nuclear power plants, because of all the advantages that I mentioned, it is indeed a long-term and a sustainable, energy source. Now, we have talked about the contentious issues, we've talked about the cost factors, we've talked about the need to innovate. But having said that, when you look at the entire spectrum, I don't think you can really get to a clean energy solution. And I think the Secretary of the Department of Energy just mentioned that a couple of days ago, and she said, this has to be part of the matrix, this has to be part of the solution. So if you look at the basket of potential clean energy solutions, I think it will be very hard for countries to ignore that because of the power density and all those things we discussed, that this is indeed long-term sustainable solution.
So it seems to me like there is a problem with understanding what nuclear energy really represents and the kinds of benefit that nuclear energy can bring to a nation. So if
Right.
you look at developing countries, for instance, or general public in particular, how can we educate the public the benefits of nuclear power then?
That is a very good question. So in my view, there are 6 pillars or 6 groups of stakeholders that need to be addressed. One is the political spectrum, right, in any country, and this applies to, frankly, any country that's looking at this. The political spectrum, the education, the knowing what are the pros, what are the cons, what are the, kind of the boundary conditions for some of these endeavors. The second is the bureaucrats, and the bureaucracy that needs to implement some of these solutions, or find the methods to moving forward on this. The third, I believe, is the academia. They play a big role, I think, in informing the first two, in being able to, and this is not just universities, but think tanks and so forth. I think they have an important role in that education. The fourth is the media, and the use of communication tools to be able to at least lay out the facts as they are, both pros and cons, in an accurate and in a deliberate way so that it is better understood. Then the fifth would be the industry captains. So industry captains of not necessarily only the nuclear energy, but all the other clean energy sources, and having healthy discussions and deliberations on what are the advantages of one versus the other, and so forth. And then finally, it's the end user and it's the public, right? And once they have inputs and deliberate communications, that they better understand what's involved, and then that the general fear factor of the fear of the unknown gets mitigated over time. So these are kind of the 6 buckets of stakeholders in my mind. And I think what you're doing today, for example, Professor, is part of that. I think it's a service, and especially to governments and people that may be considering the pros and cons of this.
Yeah, most leaders are afraid of what the population would do, how the population would react to saying, hey, we are going to install a nuclear facility over here. Those around the nuclear facility don't want to be there, and people in general don't want to have it. As you've mentioned some of the problems, including the disposition of the raw materials. But the question is, what are the changes that you've observed from the time when we had so many nuclear failures to now? And how can you prevent those nuclear failures from occurring?
Yeah, so there has been a lot of innovation, a lot of research and development after accidents like Fukushima in Japan, and so forth. An area, as an example, is accident-tolerant fuels, advanced reactor design, fast modular reactors, small modular reactors. So technology has come a long way, just like in any other field. There have been, of course, government-funded initiatives, as well as privately funded initiatives, to further science, to further technology, in the direction of making safer and safer systems. And I would say that over the years, there has been great progress in that field. And for the nuclear engineers, and this leads into another point I'd like to make, which is students that are pursuing STEM education, pursuing a desire to get into the field of nuclear engineering. That is the way to create a pipeline of new and young talent that come out of universities and from various angles, not just the engineering angle, but the regulatory angle, the policy angle, and so forth. The economic angle, again, because we mentioned cost as a big factor. So I think, again, awareness, maybe even at the high school level of some of these issues and, what progress has been made in technologies to make nuclear safer and what progress needs to be made in the future can inspire a generation of folks getting into it. Because again, the ultimate goal is clean energy, and with the power densities, etc. I think when you look at the various options, this is certainly a very compelling option.
Still on the question of technologies, some people fear that nuclear energy uses too much water. What's your reaction to that?
Sorry, I didn't catch it. It uses too much work?
Too much water.
Water, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that is an interesting position. I think the small modular reactors and some of the new designs, they do not actually need large water bodies. And so again, this goes back to the technology evolution since some of these thoughts were prevalent. And so if you look at the small modular reactor designs, the amount of water needed is actually not the usual conventional things that we think of.
Good. Let's circle back to students. Can you comment on employment prospects in the nuclear sector?
Yes, I think to get well-paid jobs, to contribute programs that are large in nature, to basically solve problems of national security, and this is how I see this field. There's a lot of incentive, and therefore I think employment prospects are robust going into the future, especially as clean energy becomes more and more a focus of many governments. And so I do see a strong pipeline of well-paid jobs and jobs in various aspects of it, the economics, the finance, the engineering, of course, the national security implications, the policy issues, the regulatory issues. So across multiple fields, I feel that there is potential for more high-level, well-paid jobs in this field.
So what should these students do to prepare themselves for such jobs?
I think, starting with institutions like yours and others, where just the overall awareness and the outreach to corporates that are working in this area is important. So to continue to have seminars of this kind, which bring the issue to the surface, is important. To maybe have internship type programs is important, where students can get a flavor of what is involved in a little more depth. To have exchange programs between, let's say, universities, some who may not have direct current programs that address any of this, but there are various universities that can collaborate on this, I think. And I think between corporate outreach, think tanks, and universities, that's probably the best advice for students that are interested in this career, to start to explore and understand the issues better.
I had a
you.
question.
Now we'll open it up to the audience for questions.
Sure.
Yeah, I had a question regarding, since you mentioned national security, also regarding nuclear energy. And I just remember in recent times, I don't know if you know, heard of Nicholas Chalian. He was a U.S. Air Force software chief working in the Pentagon security, and he recently resigned, basically almost kind of giving up, saying that the Chinese were far way ahead in terms of AI and cybersecurity and just kind of breaching into U.S. systems. Would nuclear security and nuclear reactors be in danger with impending, I guess, Chinese aggression or Russian aggression? Is that something that's being worked on due to the US's maybe weak infrastructure?
That's a great question on national security. And yes, the US government obviously has very strong things in place for that, like the NNSA establishment and other, it's, of course, as we go into this new world of more artificial intelligence, machine learning, quantum computing, cyber offense, cyber defense, these are all emerging technologies in emerging areas. But yes, there's a very, very robust infrastructure in place, especially for nuclear.
Good.
You said
Another
one has to
question.
stay ahead of the curve.
Yeah, I was wondering about the project that Warren Buffett and Bill Gates have proposed for a nadrium reactor in Wyoming. And it sounds like it's a pretty small project, which I think eliminates a lot of the concerns of the not in my backyard kind of issue that Dr. Pawanga was bringing up, that if it's small, it would generate enough power for 400,000 homes, and it doesn't have as big a footprint, and it doesn't use as much water. Do you think that is maybe a good way to get nuclear sort of back
Yes.
in places where, because I really think it's more like people say, yes, we need nuclear power, but don't locate it near me. And the entire state of Nevada has sort of said, don't bring nuclear waste here. and so maybe a smaller start or something could help sort of win people over. I'm not sure. I'm curious what you think.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a lot of, as I was mentioning earlier, a lot of work is being done on fast modular reactors, small modular reactors that eliminate a lot of those concerns. And I think there's great applicability across not only our country here in the US, but different countries, like Dr. Pawanga mentioned, in Africa, other areas where not only is it safer, but more economically viable. And so certainly these new small power and small modular reactor designs and fast modular reactor designs lend themselves, because that's the need of the future. And I do think, we at General Atomics, of course, working on a lot of those technologies. And so we see a great for that. So you're absolutely right.
Do you have a view on, Germany has been very anti-nuclear, and they're going to be totally shut every nuclear plant down, I think, within the next 3 years. Any idea of how they will make up for losing all of this power, if not just buy it from France's nuclear reactors?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I'm aware of what Germany is doing. But yeah, I think in general, governments will have to grapple with this issue. Is like, what's the energy mix, and how do you still have a sustainable long-term solution for the population if you take one of these things out of the mix? And it will be a challenge, because again, with the power density of nuclear and some of those initial statistics that I mentioned, it becomes a challenge to just have a solar or some of those other solutions. Not to say it doesn't need to be a basket of potential solutions, but I do personally feel that nuclear has to be part of that mix.
So are there any other questions?
I'm curious, from your perspective, which countries, if any, are actively embracing looking at nuclear energy and investing heavily to move in that direction?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm currently in India right now, in New Delhi. And India is one of those countries, as you know, are at the forefront of nuclear power, and they have a lot of expertise, obviously, in this area. If you look at, the IAEA in Vienna, they have these annual summits, and you look at the list of countries that are continue to have a very strong focus on this. It's quite an exhaustive list of countries, and I think, obviously nations with large populations, if you look at them and what they're doing, India, China, etc., they're again on a very robust path to more nuclear energy sources.
Okay, if we don't have any more questions, I would like to thank you all for coming, and also to ask you to join me in thanking Dr. Lall for keeping awake to talk to us at 5:30 a.m. Thank you, Dr. Lall.